When the arrogant tech CEO publicly ridiculed a humble farmer's organic produce at the bustling farmer's market, she never imagined his quiet response would lead to a revelation that would stun millions of viewers and transform her company's entire approach to agriculture. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Saturday morning farmers' market in Clearwater Valley was a vibrant tapestry of colors, scents, and sounds. Local vendors had arranged their stalls in neat rows across the town square, creating a maze of fresh produce, handmade crafts, and artisanal foods. The morning sun cast a golden glow over wooden tables laden with vegetables, still carrying dew from the fields, freshly baked bread steaming in the cool autumn air, and wildflower bouquets bringing splashes of color to the scene. At the far corner of the market stood a modest stall with a hand-painted sign that read, "Riverdale Farm, organic since 1976. Behind the weathered wooden table, carefully arranging his produce, was James Riverdale, a man whose appearance told the story of a life lived close to the soil. At 68, his face was deeply lined from decades under the sun, his hands calloused and strong from years of working the earth. His faded denim overalls and well-worn plaid shirt were clean, but bore the subtle stains of honest labor that no amount of washing could fully remove. James arranged his heirloom tomatoes with the same care a jeweler might handle precious gems. Each variety, Cherokee Purple, Brandywine, Green Zebra, had been cultivated through generations of seed saving and careful selection. His display was simple compared to the elaborate presentations of some neighboring stalls, but there was an authenticity to it that drew regular customers week after week. "Morning, Mr. Riverdale," called Sarah Thompson, a long-time resident who had been buying his produce for over a decade. "Those tomatoes look spectacular this week." James smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Thank you kindly, Sarah. They're at their peak right now." Had just the right amount of rain followed. By sunshine, nature knows what she's doing better than I ever could. As he spoke, a sleek black Tesla pulled up to the curb nearby, drawing attention from the market-goers. The car seemed out of place among the modest sedans and pickup trucks that typically filled the parking area. The driver's door swung open, and out stepped Alexandra Mercer, CEO of AgriNova Technologies. At 42, Alexandra had become the face of modern agricultural innovation. Her company had revolutionized commercial farming with advanced monitoring systems, genetically optimized crops, and automated harvesting solutions. Forbes had recently featured her on its cover as the woman transforming global agriculture. Her tailored charcoal pantsuit and precisely styled blonde hair projected the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms and investor meetings. Alexandra hadn't planned to visit the farmers' market that morning. She was in Clearwater Valley to finalize the purchase of a large tract of farmland where AgriNova would build its newest research facility. The market had simply caught her eye as she drove past, and on impulse she decided to stop and see what the local agricultural scene had to offer. As she walked through the market, Alexandra moved with purpose, her keen eyes evaluating each stall with the same analytical precision she applied to quarterly reports and acquisition targets. Several vendors recognized her from business magazines and news segments, creating a subtle buzz that followed her progress through the rows. "Is that Alexandra Mercer?" whispered a young vendor selling artisanal cheese. "The AgriNova woman? What's she doing here?" replied his neighbor, who sold locally milled flour. Alexandra was accustomed to being recognized. She acknowledged the curious glances with professional nods, but continued her assessment of the market's offerings. Her scrutiny was not casual. Even in this unexpected detour, she was gathering data, noting trends, and looking for potential innovations that might have commercial applications. When she reached James Riverdale's stall, she paused, studying his display of heirloom vegetables. The tomatoes particularly caught her attention, their irregular shapes and varied colors standing in stark contrast to the uniform, glossy produce her company's farms generated. James looked up from helping another customer and nodded politely to Alexandra. Though he didn't recognize her face, her demeanor and attire clearly marked her as someone from outside the community. "Good morning," he said warmly. "First time at our market? Welcome to Clearwater Valley." Alexandra picked up one of the purple Cherokee tomatoes, turning it in her manicured fingers. "These are interesting. Heirloom varieties." "Yes, ma'am," James replied. "That one there's been grown from seeds passed down in my family for 4 generations. Won't find that exact variety anywhere else." Alexandra's expression shifted to one of professional skepticism. "And what's your yield per acre with these varieties? Your pest resistance metrics?" James chuckled softly. "Well now, I don't measure things quite that way. I grow what thrives in harmony with my land. Some years are better than others, but nature has a wisdom to her cycles." By now, a small crowd had gathered, recognizing Alexandra and curious about the interaction. Among them was Michael Chen, a local reporter for the Clearwater Gazette, who discreetly began recording on his phone. Alexandra set the tomato down and gestured to James's modest display. This approach, it's quaint, certainly, but it's also inefficient and ultimately unsustainable for feeding a growing population. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Been sustaining my community for over 40 years, James replied mildly. Alexandra smiled with the practiced patience of someone explaining a complex concept to a layperson. "Yes, but at what scale?" Agrinova's enhanced. Crop varieties produce 300% more yield per acre than traditional methods, with standardized quality and appearance that consumers prefer. James nodded thoughtfully, showing no sign of offense at her dismissive tone. "Your company does. Impressive. Work, no doubt. Different goals, I suppose." "Different centuries, more like it," Alexandra replied, her voice taking on a sharper edge. The crowd around them had grown, market-goers pausing to watch the exchange. These methods might have worked well enough in the past, but modern agriculture requires scientific precision and technological innovation. She picked up another tomato, pointing to a slight imperfection on its skin. Consumers in today's market expect consistency. Irregular produce like this represents inefficiency in the system. James remained composed, his weathered face showing neither anger nor embarrassment. "There's more than one kind of efficiency, I reckon." Alexandra's expression shifted to one of mild condescension. "With all due respect, Mr. Riverdale, James Riverdale. Mr. Riverdale, agriculture is evolving rapidly. Companies like mine are developing crops that require less water, less land, and produce more food. We're solving global problems through science and innovation." She gestured to his stall. This kind of small-scale, low-tech farming is, frankly, a luxury we can no longer afford if we're serious about addressing food security. She turned slightly, now addressing the gathered crowd as much as James. Sentiment and tradition are comfortable, but they won't feed 10 billion people. If more farmers had pursued advanced agricultural education instead of relying on outdated methods passed down through families, we'd be much further along in solving these critical challenges. A tense silence fell over the market. Many of the locals shifted uncomfortably, glancing at James with concern. They knew him as a humble, hard-working fixture of their community, and Alexandra's public criticism felt unnecessarily harsh. James set down the basket of peppers he'd been arranging and turned to face Alexandra directly. Despite being several inches shorter than her in her heels, there was a quiet dignity in his posture that commanded attention. "Miss Mercer, and yes, I do recognize you now. May I ask you something?" Alexandra nodded, perhaps expecting a defense of traditional farming or an emotional response to her criticism. "When you bit into a tomato last, what did you taste?" The question, so simple and unexpected, momentarily threw Alexandra off balance. "I'm sorry?" "The last tomato you ate," James continued gently. "Did it taste like sunshine? Could you tell if it had been nurtured by morning dew or evening rain? Did it carry the complex sweetness that only comes from soil rich with life?" Before Alexandra could respond, he picked up one of his tomatoes and sliced it with a small knife, revealing its deep red interior. The rich aroma immediately wafted into the air. "There's a difference between growing food and manufacturing a product," he said, offering her a slice. "There's a difference between efficiency that's measured in quarterly profits and efficiency that's measured in generations of soil health." Alexandra hesitated before accepting the slice. The crowd watched silently as she took a small, cautious bite. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, a genuine reaction she couldn't fully suppress. "Agriculture isn't just science, Miss Mercer," James continued. "It's a relationship between people and the land that sustains them. My hands might not look impressive to you," he held up his weathered, soil-stained fingers, "but they've grown food that's nourished this community through 5 decades. They know things about this specific piece of earth that no sensor or algorithm has learned to measure." He gestured toward his modest display. "Every vegetable here is the result of conversations I've had with my land over 40 years. I listen to what the soil tells me, what the insects and birds tell me, what the changing seasons tell me." James's voice remained gentle, carrying no anger or defensiveness, only the quiet confidence of someone speaking a truth he'd lived. "For decades, your technology is remarkable, truly, but there's wisdom in these old methods too. Wisdom about sustainability, about resilience, about working with nature instead of trying to control it. Some knowledge can only be gained through seasons of patience, through failures and successes that teach in ways textbooks can't." The market had fallen completely silent. Even the usual background bustle had stilled as vendors and customers alike listened to James's measured response. "I never had the privilege of a college education," he continued, "but I've been a student of the land my whole life. And the land is a demanding teacher, Miss Mercer. It doesn't grade on a curve, and it doesn't accept excuses. When you make mistakes, people go hungry." Alexandra stood perfectly still, the half-eaten tomato slice still in her hand, her expression unreadable. For someone accustomed to dominating conversations in executive boardrooms, being publicly addressed in this manner, not with anger but with calm wisdom, was clearly unexpected. Perhaps, instead of asking why farmers like me haven't embraced every new technology, James concluded, we might sometimes ask what technologies have yet to learn from farmers like me. For several seconds, no one in the market moved or spoke. Then from the back of the crowd, someone began to applaud slowly. Others joined in, the sound building until it filled the market square. Alexandra's composure faltered momentarily before she regained her professional demeanor. "You make some interesting points, Mr. Riverdale," she said, her tone noticeably less dismissive than before. "I appreciate your passion for your work." She placed a $20 bill on his table. "I'll take a few of these tomatoes, for research purposes." As she turned to leave, Michael Chen, the local reporter who had been recording the exchange, stepped forward. "Ms. Mercer, Michael Chen from the Clearwater Gazette. Would you care to comment on Mr. Riverdale's perspective on agricultural sustainability?" Alexandra glanced back at James, then to the reporter. "No comment at this time. My team will reach out if we decide to issue a statement." With that, she walked briskly back to her Tesla, the crowd parting to let her through. As she drove away, conversations erupted throughout the market, people discussing what they'd witnessed, a rare moment when corporate certainty had been gently but firmly challenged by experiential wisdom. James, seemingly unfazed by the attention, returned to arranging his produce, accepting the supportive comments from regular customers with humble nods and quiet thanks. "You handled that beautifully, James," said Margaret Winters, who had been buying his vegetables for over 20 years. James smiled softly. "No sense in meeting sharp words with more of the same. The truth doesn't need volume to be heard." What James Riverdale didn't know, what no one at the market that morning could have anticipated, was that Michael Chen's recording was already beginning its journey across social media platforms. By evening, it would reach hundreds of thousands of viewers. By the following morning, millions would witness the exchange between the corporate CEO and the humble farmer. And none of them, least of all Alexandra Mercer, were aware of exactly who James Riverdale was, beyond his simple presentation as a local farmer. The truth that would emerge the following day would transform a brief market confrontation into a national conversation about the very meaning of agricultural expertise and innovation. As the market day continued, James sold his produce at the same unhurried pace he always maintained, taking time to share cooking suggestions and growing tips with customers. Several people bought more than usual from him that day, a quiet show of solidarity after Alexandra's public criticism. Meanwhile, across town at the Clearwater Valley Grand Hotel, Alexandra Mercer sat in her executive suite, her open laptop displaying emails and reports related to AgriNova's planned research facility. But her focus kept drifting. The farmers. Words had affected her more than she cared to admit, triggering questions about assumptions she hadn't examined in years. She found herself searching for information about Riverdale Farm, but the small operation had minimal online presence, just a few mentions in local food guides praising their heirloom varieties and sustainable practices. Nothing that explained the quiet authority with which James Riverdale had spoken about agricultural principles. As evening approached, Alexandra's phone rang. It was her head of public relations, calling with unusual urgency. "Alexandra, have you seen the video?" "What video?" From the farmer's market this morning. It's going viral. Over 200,000 views already and climbing fast. The comments are not favorable to our position. Alexandra felt a twinge of discomfort. Send me the link. Moments later, she was watching herself on screen, hearing her dismissive comments about James's farming methods played back. The camera angle, focused primarily on her face as she spoke down to the farmer, was particularly unflattering to her position. When the video captured James's response, Alexandra found herself listening more carefully than she had in person. Without the distractions of the market and her own need to formulate responses, she could hear the depth of knowledge underlying his simple language, the decades of experience informing each measured word. The comment section beneath the video was filled with thousands of responses. She has no idea who she's talking to. Corporate agriculture versus actual knowledge of the land. Wait until she finds out who he really is. This last comment appeared repeatedly in various forms. Alexandra scrolled through dozens of similar hints, all suggesting that James Riverdale was someone more significant than he appeared. Yet none provided specific details about why she should recognize his name. Do we know anything more about this farmer? She asked her PR director. We're looking into it now. But Alexandra, we need to get ahead of this. The narrative is forming without us. I recommend issuing a statement tonight acknowledging the importance of diverse agricultural approaches. Alexandra ended the call with a promise to consider the recommendation, but she found herself more interested in uncovering the mystery hinted at in the comments. Who exactly was James Riverdale, beyond the weathered hands and faded overalls? What were all these people referring to? She spent the next hour searching his name online, finding little beyond local newspaper mentions of his farm winning ribbons at the county fair and occasional references to his involvement in community seed-saving programs. Finally, she expanded her search to academic databases that AgriNova subscribed to for research purposes. And there, in the archives of agricultural journals from the 1970s and 80s, she found her answer. James Riverdale, the humble farmer in overalls, who she had lectured about agricultural innovation, was Dr. James Riverdale, former chair of Sustainable Agricultural Sciences at Cornell University, holder of 3 patents related to organic pest management, and author of the groundbreaking textbook Regenerative Agricultural Systems that had influenced a generation of agricultural scientists. More striking still, as she dug deeper, she discovered that early in his academic career, Riverdale had been offered a prestigious position at the very research institute that had eventually spun off into AgriNova Technologies. He had declined, choosing instead to put his theories into practice by establishing a working farm that would demonstrate the principles of regenerative agriculture over decades, not quarterly reporting periods. The revelation hit Alexandra like a physical force. She had stood in a public market and condescendingly explained modern agriculture to one of the foundational thinkers in sustainable agricultural science, a man whose work was cited in her company's own research publications, whose methodologies had informed aspects of AgriNova's organic division. And he had responded not by humiliating her with his credentials, but by offering a simple slice of tomato and speaking from direct experience. As this realization sank in, Alexandra's phone rang again. This time, it was the CEO of the parent company that owned AgriNova. Alexandra, we need to talk about this farmers market situation. The board is concerned about potential impact on the Clearwater Valley acquisition. The conversation that followed was tense but productive. By its end, Alexandra had convinced the board to give her 24 hours to handle the situation personally before they implemented crisis management protocols. After hanging up, she sat in silence for several minutes, contemplating her next move. Professional damage control would be the standard approach. A carefully worded statement, perhaps a small donation to local agricultural programs, and moving forward with business as planned. But something about that approach felt inadequate to the moment. James Riverdale could have embarrassed her with his credentials. Instead, he had chosen to engage with her on the merits of the farming philosophy itself, not through appeals to his authority. There was a lesson in that choice, one that resonated more deeply with each passing hour. Eventually, Alexandra reached a decision. Instead of drafting a statement with her PR team, she picked up her phone and made a call to the Clearwater Gazette, asking specifically to speak with Michael Chen. Her request was simple. She wanted to visit Riverdale Farm the following morning, and she hoped he might facilitate an introduction. Creating and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Sunday morning dawned clear and bright over Clearwater Valley. The early light painted the rolling farmland in shades of gold and amber, highlighting the transition from summer to fall. At Riverdale Farm, James was already at work, moving through his fields with the unhurried rhythm that had defined his days for decades. He worked methodically, checking plants for signs of stress or disease, observing which beneficial insects were active, noting which areas might need attention in the coming days. Each observation was mentally recorded with the precision of a scientist, though he carried no clipboard or digital device. When he heard a vehicle approaching on the gravel drive, James straightened, removing his worn work gloves. He wasn't expecting visitors this early, especially on a Sunday. The black Tesla that appeared around the bend was immediately recognizable. Alexandra Mercer parked beside James's weathered pickup truck, the contrast between the vehicles mirroring the apparent differences between their owners. But this morning, Alexandra had made a conscious choice to dress differently, exchanging her business attire for simple jeans, a button-up shirt, and boots that wouldn't mind getting dirty. Behind her came a second vehicle, Michael Chen from the Clearwater Gazette. "Good morning, Mr. Riverdale," Alexandra called as she approached, her tone markedly different from their market encounter. "I hope you don't mind an unexpected visit." James nodded in greeting. "Welcome to Riverdale Farm, Ms. Mercer, Mr. Chen." If he was surprised by their arrival, he showed no sign of it. "What brings you out this way on a Sunday?" Alexandra took a breath, centering herself. "I owe you an apology, Dr. Riverdale." James's expression remained unchanged, neither surprised by Alexandra's use of his academic title, nor particularly moved by her apology. He simply gestured toward a nearby wooden bench beneath an ancient apple tree. "Let's sit a while," he suggested. As they settled on the bench, Michael Chen positioned himself discreetly nearby, his camera capturing the moment but not intruding upon it. The morning sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows across their faces. "I did some research last night," Alexandra began, "about your work at Cornell, your patents, your textbook." James nodded slightly. "That was another lifetime ago. Why didn't you mention any of that yesterday when I spoke to you that way?" James considered her question, his weathered hands resting comfortably on his knees. What purpose would it have served? Would my ideas about agriculture have been more valid if you'd known I once had an office with my name on the door? Alexandra found herself unexpectedly affected by the simple wisdom of the question. In her world, credentials and titles were the currency of authority. The notion that one might deliberately set them aside was almost incomprehensible. Most people would have used those credentials to establish their expertise, she remarked. I've found that true expertise doesn't need much announcing, James replied. It shows itself in results, in the health of what grows, in sustainability over time. He gestured toward his fields. These 40 acres have more to say about what I know than any degree hanging on a wall. Alexandra looked out across the farm. Unlike the vast, uniform fields of Agrinova's operations, Riverdale Farm was a complex mosaic of different crops growing together in carefully designed patterns. Fruit trees created windbreaks for more delicate vegetables. Flowering plants attracted beneficial insects. The entire landscape seemed to flow with a natural logic that was simultaneously wild and precisely managed. Your approach is so different from what we do at Agrinova, she observed. Different tools for different purposes, James said. Your company excels at maximizing short-term yield and standardization. That has its place in feeding the world. But there are other metrics worth optimizing for: soil regeneration, biodiversity, climate resilience, nutritional density. As he spoke, Alexandra noticed something she had missed in their market encounter. Beneath James's simple language and humble demeanor lay a mind of extraordinary precision. He wasn't opposed to science or innovation, he simply approached them from a fundamentally different philosophy. Would you show me around? She asked, surprising herself with the sincerity of her request. For the next 2 hours, Alexandra followed James through his farm, listening as he explained the intricate systems that made it function. He showed her how certain plants supported others, creating natural pest management. He demonstrated how his irrigation system used 70% less water than conventional methods while maintaining productivity. He explained how decades of composting and cover cropping had built soil so rich that it sequestered more carbon per acre than most forests. What struck Alexandra most was that for every practice James described, he could articulate both the scientific principle behind it and the subtle observational wisdom that could never be captured in a textbook. It was a seamless integration of academic knowledge and experiential learning that challenged her assumption that progress required choosing between tradition and innovation. This section here, James explained, leading her to a field where different varieties of squash grew alongside corn and climbing beans, is planted the way indigenous communities in this region did for centuries before European arrival. 3. Sisters agriculture, each plant supporting the others in a natural symbiosis. He knelt down, gently moving a broad squash leaf to reveal the soil beneath. Modern science has confirmed what traditional knowledge discovered through careful observation. This polyculture produces more total nutrition per acre than any of these crops grown in monoculture, while building soil health rather than depleting it. Alexandra knelt beside him, examining the rich, dark earth teeming with visible microbial life. Our research division has been experimenting with polyculture, but the complexity makes it difficult to mechanize. James nodded. That's the fundamental tension, isn't it? Mechanization favors simplicity, Rows of identical plants with identical needs, but nature thrives on complexity and diversity. As they continued walking, Alexandra found herself asking increasingly specific questions about yield, pest management, and seasonal challenges. James answered each with the detail and precision of the scientist he had once formerly been, while contextualizing everything within the practical reality of daily farm management. Near a section of vibrant heirloom tomato plants, the same varieties she had criticized at the market, James paused. These plants have adapted to this specific microclimate over generations. Their genetics have co-evolved with the local soil biology. That's something no laboratory can replicate, no matter how sophisticated the technology. He picked a perfectly ripe specimen and offered it to Alexandra. The flavor complexity comes from that co-evolution, from slightly stressing the plants at exactly the right time in their growth cycle, from the mineral composition of this particular hillside. Alexandra took a bite, closing her eyes briefly at the intensity of flavors, sweet, tangy, rich with the essence of summer sunshine. It was leagues beyond the engineered uniformity of commercially produced tomatoes, including those grown in Agrinova's facilities. We've been trying to achieve this flavor profile for years, she admitted. Our sensory analysis team has identified the chemical compounds, but we can't seem to replicate the complete experience. Perhaps, James suggested gently, some things resist replication because their very nature emerges from relationship to place, to specific soil, specific weather patterns, specific hands tending them over time. As they neared the end of their tour, they approached a small building that stood apart from the main barn, a modern structure that seemed incongruous with the traditional aesthetics of the rest of the farm. My research facility, James explained, noting Alexandra's curiosity. Just because I left academia doesn't mean I stopped being a scientist. Inside, Alexandra was astonished to find a fully equipped agricultural laboratory. Microscopes, climate-controlled growing chambers, monitoring equipment, and a sophisticated computer system. On the walls hung framed papers published in prestigious journals, all with James's name as lead author, with publication dates spanning from the 1970s through to the previous year. You've continued publishing research, she noted, scanning the titles. Soil microbiome responses to climate variation, long-term carbon sequestration in regenerative agricultural systems, nutritional density, comparison between heirloom and commercial tomato varieties. Science doesn't belong exclusively in universities or corporate research facilities, James said. Some questions can only be answered through decades of consistent observation and experimentation in one place. Alexandra moved slowly through the lab, gradually comprehending the significance of what she was seeing. James Riverdale hadn't abandoned scientific rigor when he left Cornell. He had simply changed the context in which he applied it, creating what amounted to a 4-decade longitudinal study of sustainable agricultural practices. Your company has cited some of this research, James mentioned casually. Your organic division has implemented several pest management approaches based on my 2010 paper. Alexandra felt a renewed surge of embarrassment at how thoroughly she had misjudged this man. I had no idea. Our R&D department doesn't always communicate the sources of their methodologies to the executive level. James smiled for the first time that morning. Corporate silos can be as limiting as agricultural ones. Both tend to prevent the cross-pollination of ideas. As they exited the lab, Michael Chen, who had been documenting their conversation and tour, stepped forward. "Dr. Riverdale, Ms. Mercer, would you be willing to sit for a more formal interview about what's transpired here today? This conversation feels significant beyond just your two perspectives." James looked to Alexandra, leaving the decision to her. After a moment's consideration, she nodded. "I think there's value in sharing this. But first, I'd like to finish our conversation, privately if that's acceptable." Chen agreed to wait, and James led Alexandra to a small orchard where wooden chairs were arranged around a rustic table beneath flowering apple trees, a natural meeting place with no pretension or corporate formality. "Yesterday at the market," Alexandra began once they were seated, "you could have immediately established your credentials. You could have humiliated me publicly by revealing your background. Why didn't you?" James considered the question thoughtfully. "In my experience, true learning rarely happens through humiliation. When people feel attacked or embarrassed, they defend their positions more rigidly. I was more interested in creating an opening for genuine exchange than in winning an argument." He gazed up at the branches above them, where apples were gradually ripening toward their fall harvest. "Besides, I left that world of academic titles and prestige deliberately. I wanted my ideas to be evaluated on their merit, not on the authority of my position." "That's remarkably rare," Alexandra observed. "Most people guard their status carefully." "Status and wisdom often exist in inverse proportion," James replied with a slight smile. "The more concerned we are with how others perceive our importance, the less capacity we have to perceive the importance in others." There was something in his manner that invited honesty, and Alexandra found herself speaking more candidly than she had intended. "Agrinova is planning to build a major research facility here in Clearwater Valley. The land purchase is nearly finalized." "I've heard the rumors," James acknowledged. $50 million investment, 300 jobs. The county commissioners are quite excited. But after seeing your farm, after understanding what you've built here, I'm questioning some of our fundamental assumptions." James waited patiently as Alexandra organized her thoughts. "Our approach has been to control every variable: soil composition, water delivery, light exposure, plant genetics. We've treated agriculture as an engineering problem to solve through technology and standardization." She gestured toward his fields. "You've shown me a different paradigm, working with natural systems rather than attempting to override them, enhancing complexity rather than reducing it." "Both approaches have their place," James said equitably. "The question is where and when each serves best." "That's just it," Alexandra replied, leaning forward intently. "Agrinova has been applying our high-tech, standardized approach universally, as if it's the only valid way forward. We've dismissed methodologies like yours as outdated or insufficient, when in reality they're addressing different aspects of the same fundamental challenges." She paused, making a decision in that moment that would alter the trajectory of her career. "Would you consider collaborating with us? Not to change what you do here, but to help us understand how to integrate these principles into our larger-scale operations, to create a hybrid approach that combines the best of both philosophies." James raised his eyebrows, clearly surprised by the suggestion. "That would be quite a departure from Agrinova's established direction." "Yes, it would," Alexandra agreed, But yesterday you offered me a tomato and asked me what I tasted. What I tasted was the difference between food as a commodity and food as something more profound. That distinction matters, not just for flavor, but for the long-term sustainability of how we feed people. She continued with growing conviction. Agrinova has the scale and resources to implement meaningful change across millions of acres. If we could integrate even some of your regenerative principles into our operations, the environmental impact would be significant. James studied her face, assessing her sincerity. These principles can't simply be bolted onto existing industrial models as marketing features. They require fundamental rethinking of the relationship between production, ecology, and time horizons. I understand that, Alexandra assured him. I'm not suggesting a superficial change. I'm proposing something much more substantial. A new division of Agrinova focused specifically on translating regenerative practices to larger scales, with you guiding its philosophical and scientific foundation. James leaned back in his chair, considering the proposal. I've had similar offers before, from companies, universities, think tanks. I've always declined because they wanted to extract my knowledge without truly committing to the deeper principles. What would make this different? Alexandra asked. Intellectual honesty, James replied simply. Recognition that this isn't about finding techniques to extract more immediate yield or create marketable green products. It's about fundamentally reimagining what agricultural success means across generations, not quarterly reports. Before Alexandra could respond, Michael Chen approached, indicating that he was ready whenever they were for the formal interview. James nodded acknowledgement, then turned back to Alexandra. Let's continue this conversation after speaking with Mr. Chen. These ideas deserve thorough consideration, not rushed decisions. The interview that followed, conducted beneath the apple trees with birds singing in the background, would prove to be one of the most viewed agricultural discussions in recent memory. Chen, recognizing the significance of what was unfolding, asked thoughtful questions that allowed both James and Alexandra to articulate their perspectives and the unexpected common ground they had discovered. Dr. Riverdale, Chen began, many viewers of yesterday's video were surprised to learn about your academic background. You deliberately chose not to mention your credentials when Ms. Mercer questioned your methods. Can you explain that decision? James nodded. Knowledge doesn't gain validity from the letters after someone's name. The living systems of this farm, the health of the soil, the quality of the food, the resilience through changing climate conditions, these are my real credentials. They speak more truthfully than any title. Chen turned to Alexandra. Ms. Mercer, your company represents the cutting edge of technological approaches to agriculture. Has today's visit changed your perspective on traditional farming methods? Alexandra considered her answer carefully, profoundly. What I've come to understand today is that what appears traditional on the surface at Riverdale Farm is actually deeply innovative. It's just operating from a different foundational philosophy. Dr. Riverdale isn't rejecting science or technology. He's applying them within a framework that prioritizes long-term sustainability and ecological relationships. She continued with growing passion. At Agrinova, we've excelled at optimizing certain variables: yield per acre, uniformity, disease, resistance. But Dr. Riverdale has shown me that we've been overlooking equally important metrics: soil carbon sequestration, biodiversity support, nutritional density, resilience to climate volatility. These aren't peripheral concerns, they're central to the future of agriculture. So what happens next? Chen asked, looking between them. James and Alexandra exchanged a glance, a moment of unspoken understanding passing between them. We're discussing the possibility of collaboration, Alexandra revealed. Not to commercialize Dr. Riverdale's specific methods, but to explore how his regenerative principles might inform new directions for AgriNova's research and development. Would that mean abandoning your current technological approaches? Chen inquired. Not abandoning, evolving, Alexandra clarified. The question isn't technology versus tradition. It's how to harness the power of modern tools within a framework that respects ecological wisdom accumulated over generations. We've been trying to engineer our way around natural systems. Perhaps we should be engineering ways to work more intelligently with them instead. James nodded. The most sophisticated technology we have is nature itself. Billions of years of evolutionary intelligence creating systems of remarkable efficiency and resilience. Our human innovations work best when they enhance these natural systems rather than attempting to replace them. As the interview continued, viewers across the country would witness something remarkable. Two individuals representing seemingly opposite approaches to agriculture finding unexpected common ground through genuine dialogue. Neither abandoned their core values, but both expanded their understanding of how those values might be expressed in more nuanced ways. When the formal interview concluded, Chen thanked them both. This conversation will air tonight on our local station, but given the interest in your market exchange, I suspect it will reach a much wider audience. After Chen departed, James and Alexandra remained seated beneath the apple trees, the morning having stretched into early afternoon. The sun had shifted overhead, casting new patterns of light and shadow across the orchard. You mentioned intellectual honesty earlier, Alexandra said, returning to their interrupted conversation. If we were to move forward with some form of collaboration, what would that look like in practical terms? James considered the question. It would begin with clear-eyed acknowledgement of trade-offs. Industrial agriculture has prioritized maximum yield and standardization at the expense of soil health, biodiversity, and nutritional quality. Regenerative approaches prioritize ecological relationships and long-term sustainability, sometimes at the expense of immediate productivity. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. The interesting question isn't which approach is universally better, it's how we might create integrated systems that capture the benefits of both while minimizing the downsides of each. That's precisely what I'm proposing, Alexandra. Agreed, but would you be willing to engage with a corporate entity like AgriNova? Our responsibilities to shareholders create pressures that academic research doesn't face. I left academia partly because of its disconnection from practical realities, James replied, and I've maintained my independence from corporate agriculture because of its typically narrow focus on quarterly results. But meaningful change requires engaging with the systems that currently dominate food production, not just criticizing them from the outside. He gestured toward his fields. This farm demonstrates what's possible on 40 acres with decades of careful management. But to address global challenges, these principles need translation to larger scales and diverse contexts. That requires resources beyond what individual farmers can mobilize. Alexandra felt a surge of excitement at the possibilities taking shape. What if we established a collaborative research center right here in Clearwater Valley? Not just an Agrinova facility, but a public-private partnership that brings together diverse stakeholders, farmers, researchers, technology developers, environmental scientists. A living laboratory, James suggested, warming to the concept, where different approaches could be tested side by side, measured against multiple metrics, not just yield and profit. Exactly, Alexandra nodded enthusiastically. We've already secured land for our planned facility. We could reconceive it as something more ambitious, a center devoted to developing and scaling regenerative technologies that work for both small farms and larger operations. With transparent research protocols and open-source findings, James added, so innovations benefit the broader agricultural community, not just private shareholders. That would require convincing my board, Alexandra acknowledged, but the business case is stronger than they might initially recognize. Consumers are increasingly demanding more sustainable food production. Regulatory pressures around carbon emissions and water usage are intensifying. Early leadership in regenerative technologies could position Agrinova ahead of inevitable industry shifts. James studied her with newfound respect. You're thinking more systemically than I gave you credit for yesterday. Alexandra smiled ruefully. Sometimes we need our assumptions challenged before we can see beyond them. Your tomato accomplished what dozens of sustainability consultants and market analyses couldn't. It made me question whether our definition of success was actually aligned with the longer-term viability of our business and the health of our customers. As the afternoon light began to mellow toward evening, they outlined the broad strokes of what would eventually become the Clearwater Institute for Regenerative Agricultural Innovation, a first-of-its-kind collaboration that would challenge conventional divisions between traditional farming wisdom and cutting-edge technology. Before departing, Alexandra asked one final question that had been lingering since their market encounter. Yesterday, you could have dismissed me entirely after my condescending remarks. Instead, you engaged thoughtfully and offered me that tomato slice. Why? James smiled, the weathered lines of his face deepening. In 40 years of farming, I've learned that the land doesn't hold grudges. If you mistreat soil one season, but then commit to restoring it the next, it doesn't reject your efforts out of spite for past mistakes. It responds to present care, present attention. He looked directly at Alexandra, his blue eyes clear and kind. People aren't so different. Most of us are doing the best we can with the understanding we currently have. When that understanding expands, so does the potential for different choices. Judgment rarely facilitates that expansion. Curiosity almost always does. Alexandra extended her hand, which James shook firmly. Thank you for your curiosity about my perspective today, she said, even when I didn't initially extend the same courtesy to you. Thank you for having the courage to reconsider, James replied. That's rarer than it should be, especially for people in positions of authority. As Alexandra drove back toward town, watching Riverdale Farm recede in her rearview mirror, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The exhilarating uncertainty of having her fundamental assumptions challenged, and the expanding sense of possibility that came with it. Her phone rang through the car's speaker system, her PR director undoubtedly calling about the viral video and damage control strategies. Alexandra took a deep breath and answered, "I need you to cancel tomorrow's meetings. We're changing direction, not just our messaging. I'll explain when I get back." She ended the call before the inevitable questions could begin, then glanced once more at Riverdale Farm in her mirror before it disappeared around a bend. Yesterday's brief, uncomfortable encounter at a farmer's market had catalyzed something unexpected. Not just a potential business pivot, but a more profound reconsideration of how knowledge is valued, how progress is measured, and how meaningful change happens. Sometimes, she reflected, the most important expertise doesn't announce itself with credentials and titles. Sometimes it speaks quietly, through calloused hands and the perfect sweetness of a sun-ripened tomato. The interview between James Riverdale and Alexandra Mercer aired on Clearwater Valley's local news that evening, but by morning it had spread far beyond the small agricultural community. Major networks picked up the story, framing it as a compelling narrative about bridging opposing worldviews in an era of increasing polarization. Agricultural journals, environmental organizations, and business publications all found different aspects to highlight. The scientific credentials behind James's seemingly simple farming approach, Alexandra's willingness to publicly reconsider her company's direction, and the unexpected collaboration emerging from what had begun as a contentious encounter. 6 months later, on a crisp spring morning, a crowd gathered on the outskirts of Clearwater Valley. The occasion was the groundbreaking ceremony for the Clearwater Institute for Regenerative Agricultural Innovation, where AgriNova had originally planned a conventional research facility focused solely on technological approaches to farming. Something far more ambitious had taken shape. The architectural plans, displayed on easels around the site, showed a campus designed to integrate harmoniously with the surrounding landscape. Solar panels resembling crop rows would provide renewable energy. Living roofs would reduce temperature fluctuation while supporting pollinator habitat. Rainwater capture systems would demonstrate water conservation principles. At the center of it all stood the preserved farmhouse from the property, a symbolic bridge between agricultural heritage and innovation. Alexandra Mercer stood at a podium before the assembled crowd, looking markedly different from the woman who had visited the farmer's market 6 months earlier. She still projected confidence and authority, but there was a new authenticity to her presence. Less rehearsed, more genuinely engaged. Her corporate attire had been exchanged for practical clothing, better suited to a working agricultural site. "When I came to Clearwater Valley last fall," she began, "I arrived with certain assumptions about the future of agriculture. Assumptions that prioritized technology, standardization, and control over natural variables. Those assumptions weren't entirely wrong, but they were incomplete." She gestured toward James Riverdale, who stood nearby, his weathered hands folded calmly before him. "My encounter with Dr. Riverdale challenged me to expand my thinking. Not by rejecting technological innovation, but by recognizing that the most sophisticated technology on this planet is the living system that has evolved over billions of years to create and maintain conditions suitable for life." The crowd, which included local farmers, AgriNova executives, university researchers, environmental advocates, and government officials, listened with rapt attention. "Today, we break ground on something unprecedented, a research institute dedicated to integrating diverse knowledge systems. Here, cutting-edge technology will be developed in conversation with generational farming wisdom. Digital monitoring systems will enhance, not replace, the observational intelligence that comes from daily interaction with living soil and plants. Corporate efficiency will be balanced with ecological resilience. Alexandra stepped away from the podium, inviting James to join her. Together they lifted the ceremonial shovel and turned the first soil for the foundation of the main building. "This institute represents more than a new research facility," James said, when it was his turn to address the gathering. "It represents a new way of thinking about progress, not as a linear path where new ideas necessarily displace older ones, but as an expanding web of understanding where different approaches complement and enhance each other." Among those watching was Michael Chen, whose reporting had helped catalyze this unexpected development. Beside him stood his editor, Claire Watkins, who had initially been skeptical about dedicating significant coverage to what seemed like a minor local dispute. "I've never seen anything quite like this," Claire murmured. "A Fortune 500 company, completely pivoting their approach based on a farmer's market conversation." Michael smiled. "It wasn't just any conversation, and Riverdale isn't just any farmer." As the ceremony concluded, Alexandra approached them. "You two played a crucial role in making this happen," she acknowledged. "Without your reporting, that market encounter might have remained a private exchange instead of sparking a national conversation." "We just documented what happened," Michael replied modestly. "You and Dr. Riverdale did the hard work of finding common ground." Alexandra nodded thoughtfully. "Finding common ground is rarely the problem. It's being willing to stand on it together, even when it feels unfamiliar. That's the real challenge." The groundbreaking ceremony transitioned to a community celebration, held on the grounds of what would become the Institute's demonstration farm. Tables laden with local produce, much of it from Riverdale Farm, created a tangible connection between the day's formal proceedings and the living reality of sustainable agriculture. As attendees mingled, sampling foods and discussing the Institute's potential, Alexandra found herself in conversation with Marcus Johnson, Agrinova's chief financial officer. He had been among the most skeptical executives when she had first proposed the dramatic shift in their Clearwater Valley investment. "I have to admit," Marcus said, surveying the enthusiastic crowd, "when you first pitched this concept to the board, I thought you'd lost your mind, abandoning our established R&D model to collaborate with a farmer who criticized our approach in a viral video. It seemed like reactive PR rather than sound strategy." Alexandra smiled, remembering the intense board meetings and late-night presentations she'd navigated to secure approval for the new direction. "And now?" "The market response has been illuminating," Marcus acknowledged. "Our stock price is up 12% since we announced the Institute. The talent we've attracted to the project includes researchers who previously wouldn't consider working for a corporation like ours. And the pre-orders for our first regenerative technology pilot projects have exceeded projections by nearly 40%. It turns out," Alexandra observed, "that reconciling seemingly opposite approaches creates possibilities neither could achieve independently. We're not just developing better agricultural methods, we're creating a new narrative about how innovation happens." Across the gathering, James was engaged in conversation with a group of young farmers who had traveled from across the state to witness the groundbreaking. Many were struggling to balance traditional practices with economic pressures that pushed toward industrialization. How do we compete with factory farms when consumers expect perfect-looking produce at rock-bottom prices? Asked Sarah Martinez, a third-generation fruit grower. James considered her question thoughtfully. For decades, we've been taught that the only way to succeed in agriculture is to get bigger, more mechanized, more standardized. That narrative serves certain interests, but it's not the only path forward. He gestured toward the site, where construction would soon begin. This institute exists because enough people recognized that the future isn't about choosing between tradition and innovation. It's about intelligent integration of diverse approaches. The farms that will thrive in coming decades won't be those that simply maximize short-term yield at any cost. They'll be those that build resilience through diversity, that improve soil health year over year, that produce nutrition rather than simply calories. But those things are harder to measure on a quarterly basis, another young farmer noted. Investors want immediate returns. That's changing, James replied. Look around you today. See who's here. Multinational corporations, venture capitalists, pension fund managers. They're beginning to understand that true sustainability isn't just an ethical consideration. It's a fundamental business requirement in a world of increasing climate volatility and resource constraints. As the afternoon progressed, Alexandra found herself drawn to a quiet corner of the property where an elderly woman sat observing the proceedings with evident interest. Something about her seemed familiar, though Alexandra couldn't immediately place her. "May I join you?" Alexandra asked. The woman smiled warmly. "Please do. I've been hoping to meet you, Ms. Mercer. I'm Eleanor Riverdale, James's mother." Alexandra's surprise must have shown on her face, for Eleanor chuckled softly. "Yes, I'm still kicking at 93, though I leave most of the farm work to the younger generations these days." "It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Riverdale," Alexandra said sincerely, settling beside her. "Your son has transformed my understanding of agriculture over these past months." Eleanor's eyes, the same clear blue as her son's, sparkled with amusement. James has always had that effect on people. Even as a boy, he saw connections others missed. When he left his prestigious university position to return to farming, many thought he was throwing away his potential. They couldn't understand that. He wasn't rejecting science. He was bringing it home, grounding it in daily practice. "That's what makes his perspective so valuable," Alexandra agreed. "He bridges worlds that typically remain separate: academic research and practical application, traditional knowledge and cutting-edge innovation." Eleanor studied Alexandra thoughtfully. "You know, when James told me about your encounter at the farmer's market, I expected today might eventually come. You anticipated all this?" Alexandra gestured toward the ceremonial groundbreaking site and the gathered crowd. "Not the specifics," Eleanor clarified. "But I've lived long enough to recognize when genuine transformation is possible. It requires two things that were present that day at the market: wisdom offered without ego, and criticism received without defensiveness. Those qualities are rarer than they should be, especially among successful people." The elderly woman gazed across the landscape that would soon house the innovative institute. "This land has been farmed for generations. The indigenous people who tended it before European settlement understood things about its patterns and possibilities that we're only now rediscovering through science. Each generation learns and forgets, innovates and preserves." She turned back to Alexandra. What you and James are creating here isn't just a research facility. It's a conversation across time, between past wisdom and future possibilities, between different ways of knowing and working with the land. As the celebration continued into early evening, James and Alexandra found themselves standing together on a small rise overlooking the property, watching the sunset paint the fields in gold and amber. 6 months ago, if someone had told me we'd be here today, I would have thought they were delusional, Alexandra admitted. Agrinova investing millions in a collaborative institute co-designed with a small-scale organic farmer who publicly challenged our entire approach. James smiled. Life rarely follows the paths we anticipate. The most significant growth often comes from unexpected disruptions to our carefully planned trajectories. I've been thinking about what made this possible, Alexandra said after a moment. Not just the institute, but the shift in thinking it represents. It would have been so easy for our interaction to become another polarized standoff. Corporate agriculture versus traditional farming, technology versus nature, profit versus sustainability. The kind of debate where everyone leaves more entrenched in their original positions. What prevented that outcome, do you think? James asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Alexandra considered carefully before answering. You didn't reject my criticism as coming from someone with no valuable perspective. And eventually I didn't dismiss your wisdom as merely nostalgic or unscalable. We both recognized that the other person held pieces of truth we needed. James nodded. The most dangerous phrase in agriculture, perhaps in any field, is, "There's only one right way." The moment we become certain our approach is the only valid one, we stop learning. Agrinova fell into that trap, Alexandra acknowledged. We became so convinced that technological optimization was the only path to feeding the world, that we dismissed alternative approaches without truly understanding them. We confused complexity with inefficiency, diversity with disorder. And many traditional farmers make the opposite mistake, James added fairly. They reject technological innovations that could enhance their practices while preserving core principles. They confuse all change with loss, all science with reductionism. As darkness began to fall, lights illuminated the gathering below, where farmers, scientists, business leaders, and community members continued to engage in animated conversation. People who might never have found themselves in dialogue were exchanging perspectives, challenging assumptions, discovering unexpected common ground. That, James said, gesturing toward the diverse gathering, is as important as any building we construct or research we conduct. Creating spaces where different knowledge systems can interact respectfully. That's how genuine innovation happens. Strange. 1 year later, the Clearwater Institute for Regenerative Agricultural Innovation was no longer just an architectural rendering. Its main research building stood completed, its curved lines and living walls designed to harmonize with rather than dominate the landscape. Around it, demonstration fields showcased various integrated approaches to sustainable food production, some focusing on traditional companion planting enhanced by modern monitoring technology, others exploring how robotics could be adapted to work within diversified rather than monocropped systems. Alexandra Mercer stood in her office at the Institute, reviewing quarterly results that would soon be presented to Agrinova's board of directors. The data told a compelling story of early success. Pilot technologies developed at the Institute, were showing promising results in field trials across different regions and scales of operation. Patent applications were increasing. Research partnerships with universities and international organizations had expanded the Institute's scope far beyond initial projections. More significantly, farmers implementing the Institute's integrated approaches were reporting improved resilience to extreme weather events, a critical advantage in an era of climate volatility. The regenerative methods were demonstrating measurable improvements in soil carbon sequestration, water retention, and biodiversity support while maintaining competitive yields. A knock at her door interrupted Alexandra's review. James Riverdale entered, carrying a small wooden crate filled with freshly harvested vegetables. At 69, he remained active in both his farm operations and his role as the Institute's Director of Regenerative Systems Design. "Thought you might enjoy some of the first harvest from the demonstration fields," he said, setting the crate on her desk. The vibrant colors and fresh aromas of just-picked produce provided a sensory reminder of what all their data and research ultimately served: the production of nourishing food in ways that sustained rather than depleted the living systems supporting it. "Perfect timing," Alexandra smiled. "I'm preparing for the board presentation next week. These will make a much more compelling statement than slides alone." She gestured toward the documents spread across her desk. "The numbers are strong, by the way. Our integrated pest management system is showing a 62% reduction in chemical inputs while maintaining yields within 5% of conventional methods. The soil monitoring network has expanded to 5,000 farms across 3 continents, and the carbon sequestration metrics are exceeding even our most optimistic projections." James nodded approvingly. Numbers matter. They help convince those who need quantification to recognize value. He selected a particularly perfect tomato from the crate and placed it on top of the financial reports. "But this matters too. The tangible reality behind the data. Never let the metrics become more important than what they measure." It was a gentle reminder of the balance they had worked to maintain throughout the Institute's development, between measurable outcomes and qualitative values, between scientific rigor and sensory wisdom, between innovative technologies and time-tested practices. "The board chairman is visiting tomorrow," Alexandra mentioned. "He's bringing several major investors who want to see firsthand what we're developing here." "How are you feeling about that?" James asked, knowing that maintaining corporate support for the Institute's sometimes unconventional approaches required constant advocacy on Alexandra's part. "More confident than I was 6 months ago," she admitted. "The preliminary results are compelling enough that even the most skeptical board members are coming around, and consumers are driving change faster than we anticipated. Demand for products grown using regenerative methods increased 84% last quarter." "Public perception has shifted remarkably quickly," James agreed. 10 years ago, regenerative agriculture was considered a fringe concept. Now it's featured in mainstream business publications and political platforms. As they continued discussing the upcoming presentation, Alexandra's assistant appeared at the door. "Sorry to interrupt, but you both have visitors. A group of agricultural students from Cornell. They're a bit early for their scheduled tour." "Send them in," Alexandra replied, gathering her documents to make space on the conference table. 20 young men and women filed into the office, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and admiration. These were graduate students in Cornell's Sustainable Agricultural Sciences program, the same department James had once chaired before choosing to focus on his practical farming work. "Welcome to Clearwater Institute," Alexandra greeted them. "I'm Alexandra Mercer, and this is Dr. James Riverdale, though many of you probably recognize him from your textbooks." The students' reactions confirmed that James's academic reputation remained significant despite his decades away from formal university life. Several clutched copies of his groundbreaking textbook, clearly hoping for an autograph. "Dr. Riverdale was my inspiration for studying sustainable agriculture," one young woman acknowledged. "His papers on mycelial networks in regenerative systems completely changed my understanding of soil ecology." James accepted the comment with characteristic humility. "The fungi were doing remarkable work long before I wrote about them. I just had the privilege of paying attention." For the next hour, Alexandra and James guided the students through a discussion of the Institute's work, answering questions about everything from technical research methodologies to the philosophical foundations of their collaborative approach. The students were particularly interested in how a Fortune 500 company had come to embrace regenerative principles, typically associated with smaller-scale operations. "The story you've probably heard about the farmers' market confrontation makes for good media," Alexandra explained, "but the reality was more nuanced. What happened that day wasn't just about agriculture. It was about different ways of knowing and valuing expertise." She gestured toward James. "Dr. Riverdale could have established his authority through credentials, but instead he demonstrated knowledge through direct evidence. The quality of what he grew, the health of his soil, the sustainable practices, proven over decades. That approach challenged me to reconsider what constitutes valuable expertise in our field." "Miss Mercer," James added, "could have dismissed traditional methods as outdated without investigating their potential value to modern challenges. Instead, she had the intellectual courage to question her assumptions and integrate new understanding into her company's approach. That's rarer than scientific brilliance in my experience." As the tour continued beyond Alexandra's office to the research laboratories and demonstration fields, the students witnessed firsthand the integration of traditional farming wisdom. With cutting-edge technology, soil sensors developed based on indigenous understanding of microbiome relationships, automated harvesting systems designed to work within polyculture rather than monoculture environments, drone monitoring programmed to recognize biodiversity patterns as indicators of system health. Near the end of their visit, one student asked the question that seemed to be on many minds: "How do you measure success here? Is it primarily about profit, productivity, sustainability, or something else?" Alexandra and James exchanged a glance, each deferring to the other to answer. Finally, James spoke. "Success has multiple dimensions. For a commercial enterprise like AgriNova, financial sustainability matters. The approaches developed here need to be economically viable for farmers and the broader agricultural system. For environmental sustainability, we measure impacts on soil health, water quality, biodiversity, and carbon sequestration. For social sustainability, we consider impacts on rural communities, farmer well-being, and consumer health." He paused, then continued with deeper reflection. "But perhaps the most fundamental measure is time horizon. Agriculture has always been an intergenerational project. The most successful farmers I've known weren't just thinking about next season's crop, but about whether their great-grandchildren would inherit land with more or less potential than they received. Alexandra nodded in agreement. One of the most valuable shifts in our approach has been extending the time frame for measuring outcomes. Quarterly reporting remains a reality for a publicly traded company, but we've created metrics that track progress across multiple scales: seasonal productivity, annual profitability, 5-year soil improvement trends, and projections for multi-decadal ecosystem health. As the students departed, clearly inspired by what they had witnessed, Alexandra and James found themselves alone again in the demonstration field, surrounded by the living results of their unexpected collaboration. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" Alexandra asked. "If I hadn't stopped at the farmer's market that day? If you had responded differently to my criticism?" James smiled, his weathered face creasing with the wisdom of someone who had spent decades observing how small actions influence complex systems. "I've learned that the most significant transformations often pivot on seemingly minor moments. A chance encounter, a curious question, a decision to listen rather than simply defend one's position." He knelt to examine a particularly vibrant section of soil where cover crops grew between rows of primary production. Gently brushing aside some leaves, he revealed the rich, dark earth teeming with visible life, the foundation of agricultural abundance that industrial methods had often overlooked in their focus on above-ground productivity. "This soil," he said, "doesn't care about our credentials or corporate titles. It responds to how we treat it, not who we claim to be. There's a profound lesson in that for all human endeavors, judged by results and relationships, not by hierarchies and status." Standing again, he gazed across the institute grounds where researchers, farmers, technologists, and students moved through various projects, each contributing different forms of knowledge to a shared pursuit of more resilient food systems. "What we've created here isn't just about reconciling traditional farming with technological innovation," he observed. "It's about recognizing that knowledge itself is a living system, one that thrives on diversity, connection, and the humility to acknowledge that no single approach contains the whole truth." Alexandra nodded, understanding more deeply than she could have imagined a year earlier. "The most promising path forward isn't choosing between opposing worldviews. It's creating spaces where different ways of knowing can cross-pollinate, where the wisdom of experience and the precision of science can enhance rather than compete with each other." As the sun began to set over the Clearwater Institute, casting long shadows across fields where ancient agricultural wisdom and cutting-edge technology were finding unprecedented harmony, James and Alexandra knew they had created something that transcended their individual visions. From a moment of potential conflict had emerged a new model of collaboration, one that recognized how the most enduring innovations often arise not from technological breakthrough alone, but from the thoughtful integration of timeless wisdom with contemporary possibilities. The Institute stood as living proof that when we approach differences with curiosity rather than judgment, when we value diverse forms of expertise rather than privileging only those with formal credentials, we create the conditions for transformation that serves not just our immediate interests but the well-being of generations to come. 5 years had passed since the groundbreaking of the Clearwater Institute for Regenerative Agricultural Innovation. What had begun as a confrontation between opposing agricultural philosophies had blossomed into a globally recognized center for integrated approaches to sustainable food production. The Institute's campus had expanded to include multiple research facilities, demonstration farms showcasing various scales of operation, and an educational center that welcomed visitors from around the world. On a brilliant autumn morning, a sleek hybrid SUV pulled up to the visitor center. From it emerged Dr. Sophia Chen, the newly appointed United Nations Special Envoy for Global Food Security. At 45, Dr. Chen had established herself as one of the world's foremost authorities on sustainable agriculture in developing nations. Her appointment to this unprecedented UN position reflected the growing international recognition that food systems stood at the intersection of the most pressing challenges facing humanity: climate change, biodiversity loss, water scarcity, and social equity. As she entered the center's main atrium, Sophia paused to admire the living wall that stretched 3 stories high, showcasing hundreds of plant varieties arranged in a system that simultaneously demonstrated aesthetic beauty and ecological relationships. The building itself had become famous for its biophilic design, harvesting rainwater, generating renewable energy, and creating a working environment that increased creativity and well-being among its occupants. Dr. Chen, welcome to Clearwater. Sophia turned to find Alexandra Mercer approaching. At 47, Alexandra had evolved significantly from the corporate executive who had once dismissed traditional farming methods at a local market. She remained CEO of AgriNova, but her leadership, style and vision had transformed, influencing the entire company's approach to agricultural innovation. Under her guidance, AgriNova had become the industry leader in regenerative technologies, proving that ecological wisdom and corporate success could be complementary rather than contradictory. Alexandra, thank you for hosting me today, Sophia replied warmly as they exchanged a handshake. The UN Technical Committee was unanimous in recommending Clearwater as our first site visit following the Global Food Systems Summit. Alexandra led her guest toward a conference room where other key figures awaited. We're honored to be included in your assessment. I understand you're evaluating potential models for the UN's new Resilient Agriculture Initiative. Exactly, Sophia confirmed. After decades of fragmented approaches to agricultural development, there's growing recognition that we need integrated models that work across different scales and contexts. What you've created here represents one of the most promising examples we've identified. They entered the conference room, where James Riverdale was engaged in animated conversation with a diverse group of visitors. At 74, his face bore additional lines of wisdom, but his eyes remained sharp, and his enthusiasm for sharing knowledge undiminished. He had officially retired from daily management of his farm, passing primary operations to his grandson Michael, but he remained actively involved with the Institute as its elder advisor, a position created specifically to recognize the value of his experience-based wisdom. Around the table sat representatives from major agricultural regions worldwide: a rice farmer from Vietnam, an orchard manager from New Zealand, a grain producer from Ukraine, a coffee cooperative leader from Colombia, and an urban farming innovator from Nigeria. This Farmer Advisory Council had become a central feature of the Institute's governance structure, ensuring that practical agricultural knowledge informed all research directions and technological developments. Dr. Chen, welcome, James greeted her, rising to his feet. I've been an admirer of your work on drought-resistant farming systems in East Africa since you published your findings in 2028. Sophia smiled, clearly pleased by his familiarity with her research. And I've assigned your recent paper on mycelial network enhancement in degraded soils to all my graduate students, Dr. Riverdale. Your integration of traditional observation with advanced monitoring technology has revolutionized how we approach soil restoration. After introductions were complete, the group settled around the table for what would prove to be a pivotal conversation about the future of global agriculture. Alexandra initiated the discussion with an overview of the Institute's evolution over the previous 5 years. When we founded Clearwater, many skeptics viewed it as either a corporate greenwashing exercise or an impractical, idealistic experiment, she acknowledged candidly. Few believed that meaningful integration between traditional agricultural wisdom and cutting-edge technology was possible at commercially viable scales. She gestured toward the windows, which overlooked demonstration fields where various agricultural approaches were being implemented side by side. Today, we have data from over 10,000 partner farms across 6 continents. The evidence is clear. Regenerative methods enhanced by appropriate technology consistently outperform conventional industrial agriculture on multiple metrics: profitability over 5-year timeframes, resilience to climate disruption, soil and carbon sequestration, water efficiency, and nutritional density of produce. Sophia leaned forward with interest. The UN assessment team was particularly impressed by your scaling methodology, the way you've adapted these approaches to work across dramatically different contexts and operation sizes. James nodded. That's been one of our central challenges and greatest successes. Traditional wisdom tends to be highly location-specific, practices developed through generations of farmers observing what works in their particular microclimate and soil conditions. The trick wasn't to create a universal system, but rather to develop translational principles that can be adapted to local conditions. Alexandra activated a holographic display in the center of the table, showing a 3-dimensional model of interconnected agricultural systems. We call this the Adaptive Resilience Framework. Rather than prescribing specific techniques, it identifies key ecological relationships that must be maintained regardless of scale or context. Local knowledge then informs exactly how those relationships are supported in each specific environment. The model rotated slowly, highlighting different connection points between soil health, water cycles, biodiversity, and productivity. Technology enters the system not to override these relationships, but to monitor, support, and enhance them, Alexandra explained. For instance, our soil microbiome sensors don't tell farmers what to do. They provide real-time feedback on how management decisions are affecting underground ecosystems, allowing for more responsive and precise adjustments. Amare Okafor, the urban farming innovator from Nigeria, added his perspective. What's been revolutionary for our vertical farming operations in Lagos is how this framework allowed us to maintain ecological principles even in highly controlled environments. Previous urban farming technologies treated soil as merely a substrate. The Clearwater approach helped us create genuinely living systems within our buildings, dramatically improving both efficiency and nutrition. For the next hour, the conversation flowed through detailed examples of how the Institute's integrated approach had been adapted across different agricultural contexts. The Vietnamese rice farmer described how ancient water management techniques had been enhanced with precision monitoring technology to reduce methane emissions while increasing drought resilience. The Ukrainian grain producer explained how reintroducing traditional crop rotations supported by automated weeding robots had simultaneously rebuilt soil and reduced dependency on chemical inputs. Sophia listened intently, occasionally asking incisive questions that revealed her deep understanding of agricultural systems. As the discussion progressed, she began taking more extensive notes, clearly connecting what she was hearing to broader implications for global food security policy. "What strikes me most," she observed during a brief pause, "is how you've managed to transcend the false dichotomy between tradition and innovation that has dominated agricultural discourse for decades. You're demonstrating that these aren't opposing forces, but complementary aspects of a more comprehensive approach to food production." James smiled, exchanging a knowing glance with Alexandra. That realization was the seed from which all this grew, literally from a moment when a corporate CEO and a traditional farmer recognized that each held pieces of wisdom the other needed. Alexandra nodded. 5 years ago, I would have defined agricultural progress exclusively in terms of technological advancement and yield maximization. James helped me understand that genuine progress requires a more nuanced definition, one that includes soil regeneration, ecosystem health, community well-being, and generational thinking. And I, James added, might have remained skeptical about how corporate resources and technological innovation could enhance rather than undermine traditional agricultural wisdom. Alexandra helped me recognize that scale matters when addressing global challenges, and that not all technology seeks to dominate natural systems. Some can be designed to work in harmony with them. After the formal meeting concluded, Alexandra suggested they continue their conversation while walking through the demonstration fields. As they moved from the climate-controlled building into the open air, the sensory experience shifted dramatically. The rich aroma of healthy soil mixing with the subtle fragrances of diverse plantings, the sound of insects and birds creating a living soundtrack that testified to the biodiversity their methods supported. "This section," James explained as they walked along a path between fields, "demonstrates our integrated pest management approach. Rather than viewing insects as enemies to be eliminated, we're creating balanced ecosystems where beneficial predators naturally control potential pest populations." He gestured toward flowering borders planted alongside vegetable crops. "These aren't just decorative. They're functional habitat for pollinators and predatory insects." The traditional farmers in Mexico's milpa systems understood these relationships centuries ago. "We've added monitoring technology that tracks insect populations in real time, allowing for precision interventions only when ecosystems temporarily fall out of balance." Sophia studied the vibrant, diverse landscape, so different from the sterile monocultures that still dominated much industrial agriculture. The biodiversity, compared to conventional systems, is remarkable. "Have you quantified the difference?" Alexandra nodded. "Our partner farms average 47% more insect species and 62% more bird diversity than comparable conventional operations. More importantly, that biodiversity translates directly to resilience. These systems recover from extreme weather events approximately 3 times faster than monoculture systems. As they continued their tour, they approached a section where robotic harvesters moved with surprising delicacy through interplanted crops, distinguishing between species and selecting only those fruits and vegetables that had reached optimal ripeness. This is where high technology and traditional wisdom find perhaps their most elegant integration, Alexandra explained. The robots use advanced machine learning to mimic the selective harvesting practiced by skilled human pickers, but at scales that would be impractical for hand labor alone. The algorithm is fascinating, James added. It's continuously learning from both sensor data and the embodied knowledge of experienced farmers. Each season, it becomes more precise in understanding the subtle cues of perfect ripeness that used to require decades of human experience to master. Sophia stopped to observe the robot's gentle, precise movements. This challenges another false dichotomy, that technology necessarily replaces human knowledge rather than preserving and enhancing it. Exactly, Alexandra agreed. We explicitly designed these systems not to eliminate the need for human wisdom, but to amplify its impact and preserve it for future generations. As they approached the Institute's seed bank and genetic preservation facility, they encountered a group of elementary school children being guided by Michael Riverdale, James's grandson. At 30, Michael embodied the integration of traditional and innovative approaches, raised with his grandfather's deep ecological understanding, but educated in advanced agricultural science at Cornell University. The children listened in fascination as Michael explained how seeds carried stories across generations, stories of adaptation, resilience, and relationship with human communities. He showed them heirloom varieties preserved from near extinction, explaining how each contained genetic information that might prove crucial for adapting to changing climate conditions. This is perhaps our most important work, James said quietly as they observed from a respectful distance, connecting young people to food systems in ways that honor both ancient wisdom and future possibilities. Alexandra nodded. We host over 5,000 school children annually. Many have never seen a vegetable growing before they visit us. For some, it's their first direct experience of the living systems that sustain them. After completing their tour, Sophia, Alexandra, and James settled on a shaded terrace overlooking the entire Institute campus. The late afternoon sun cast a golden light across the demonstration fields, the research buildings, and the educational center, elements that had once seemed incompatible now visibly harmonized in a unified vision. I've visited agricultural research centers worldwide, Sophia reflected, from the most high-tech corporate facilities to traditional farming communities maintaining practices centuries old. What you've created here is unique, not just in physical infrastructure but in conceptual framework. You've developed a genuine synthesis rather than a mere compromise between different agricultural philosophies. James smiled. The word compromise suggests each side giving up something valuable. What we've discovered is that integration actually enhances both traditional wisdom and technological innovation. Each becomes more effective in relationship with the other. The timing of this model couldn't be more critical, Sophia continued. The latest climate projections suggest agricultural systems worldwide will face unprecedented stresses in the coming decades. Conventional industrial approaches are proving increasingly vulnerable to these disruptions, while purely traditional methods often can't produce at the scales needed for global food security. She turned to Alexandra. The UN Technical Committee will recommend that the Clearwater framework be adopted as the foundation for our new Resilient Agriculture initiative. We'd like to establish similar integrated institutes in key agricultural regions worldwide, adapted to local conditions, but connected through a shared framework of principles. Alexandra's expression reflected both honor and responsibility. AgriNova would be proud to contribute our resources and expertise to such an initiative. From a corporate perspective, I can also share that our regenerative agricultural division has become our fastest growing and most profitable segment. The business case for this approach has been definitively established. And from a traditional farming perspective, James added, I've seen how these integrated methods have revitalized rural communities that were hollowed out by industrial agriculture. Young people are returning to farming when it offers both meaningful connection to the land and engagement with innovation. The average age of farmers in our network has decreased by 12 years since we began, reversing a trend of agricultural aging that threatened generational knowledge transfer. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the Institute grounds, Sophia asked a final question that brought their conversation full circle. 5 years ago, when you too first engaged in that farmers' market exchange that's now become almost legendary, did either of you imagine this outcome? James and Alexandra exchanged a glance that communicated the depth of their journey together, from adversaries representing opposing worldviews to partners in a transformative enterprise that had exceeded either's individual vision. Not in specific form, James acknowledged, but I've always believed that wisdom inevitably finds expression when people approach differences with genuine curiosity rather than defensive posturing. The seed of possibility was present in that first encounter, in Alexandra's willingness to truly taste that tomato and consider what it represented, and in my choice to offer knowledge rather than take offense. Alexandra nodded thoughtfully. What I couldn't have anticipated was how completely this journey would transform not just AgriNova's approach to agriculture, but my own understanding of leadership and progress. I came to that farmer's market thinking I knew the future of food production. I left having taken the first step toward a much more nuanced and ultimately more hopeful vision. She gestured toward the landscape before them, the living embodiment of that evolved vision. True innovation isn't about dismissing the past in favor of novel technologies. It's about carrying forward the wisdom of generations while continuously adapting to emerging challenges. It's recognizing that the most sophisticated technology on Earth is the web of relationships that sustains living systems, and that our human innovations work best when they enhance rather than override those relationships. As twilight deepened, lights began to illuminate the Institute grounds, symbolizing the marriage of natural cycles with human ingenuity. Workers completed their day's tasks, researchers concluded experiments, and educational programs transitioned to evening sessions. The Clearwater Institute continued its work of bridging worlds, often viewed as separate, traditional and modern, ecological and technological, practical and theoretical, human and natural. Tomorrow, Sophia said, as they prepared to conclude their day, I'll present my recommendations to the UN General Assembly. I believe the Clearwater model represents not just a better approach to agriculture, but a template for addressing other complex global challenges: energy systems, water management, urban development. You've demonstrated that integrating diverse knowledge forms creates solutions more resilient than any single approach could achieve alone. James smiled, his weathered face reflecting the wisdom of someone who had witnessed profound transformation across his lifetime. The soil teaches us that health emerges from relationship between countless organisms, each contributing different qualities to the whole. Human knowledge follows the same principle. When we stop trying to determine which form of understanding is superior and instead ask how different ways of knowing might complement each other, we create the conditions for genuine breakthrough. Alexandra nodded in agreement. 5 years ago, I would have dismissed that as poetic but impractical philosophy. Today, I understand it as perhaps the most practical approach to navigating the complex challenges we face, not just in agriculture, but in all human endeavors. As stars emerged in the darkening sky above Clearwater Institute, the three figures remained on the terrace a while longer, their conversation turning to specific plans for implementing the integrated approach across diverse global contexts. The worldviews that James and Alexandra had once represented as opposing forces had evolved into a unified vision, one that honored the wisdom of the past while embracing the possibilities of the future, that respected the knowledge embedded in tradition while harnessing the power of innovation to address unprecedented challenges. From a moment of potential conflict in a small-town farmer's market had emerged a model with global implications, demonstrating how genuine listening across difference can transform not just individual understanding, but entire systems of thought and practice. The wealthy CEO had discovered wisdom beyond credentials, in a humble farmer's words. The farmer had found an unexpected ally for preserving traditional knowledge in corporate resources and technological innovation, and together they had created something neither could have developed alone: a pathway toward agricultural systems that nourished both people and planet across generations. In a world often divided by competing ideologies and entrenched positions, the Clearwater Institute stood as living proof that the most promising solutions emerge not from choosing between opposing approaches, but from the thoughtful integration of diverse wisdom traditions. The future of agriculture, and perhaps of human civilization itself, would be found not in the triumph of any single perspective, but in the fertile common ground where different forms of knowledge cross-pollinate, creating possibilities more resilient and regenerative than any could imagine alone. 10 years after Alexandra Mercer had stopped at a local farmer's market and encountered James Riverdale, their unexpected collaboration had grown beyond agriculture to influence approaches to education, community development, business management, and environmental stewardship worldwide. The principles they had discovered together, that genuine progress integrates rather than discards traditional wisdom, that technology serves best when enhancing natural systems rather than replacing them, that knowledge itself is an ecosystem, requiring diversity to thrive, had sparked a quiet revolution in how humanity approached its most pressing challenges. And it had all begun with a simple moment of choice, when criticism was met not with defensive reaction, but with the gentle offering of a slice of sun-ripened tomato And when that offering was received with unexpected openness by someone willing to reconsider deeply held assumptions, in that exchange lay a template for transformation that extended far beyond agriculture, a reminder that the seeds of revolutionary change often germinate in the humble soil of genuine human connection. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.